Here's a whopper theological question. Is God in control? The sovereignty of God. That's a complex subject that I can easily cover in 2.5 to 3 minutes. Sovereignty of God is a very complex question. It is a lot of times what people assume that means, and this comes from a position that was made very popular by Calvin a few hundred years ago, was that God was in absolute control, that everything that happens in life, in our world today, is the direct hand of God, that it is God's will. So if something terrible happens to you at work, God's will. If a fire wipes out an entire town and many lives with it, God's will. If you have cancer, God's will. If somebody you love gets killed by a drunk driver, God's will. If Hitler decides that an entire race of people, Jewish people, need to be completely wiped out, God's will. Things start to get a little flimsy after a while. We like to feel confident in this notion of God's will because it makes us feel more secure, like there's some big dude in the sky that has it all figured out and is just working it all out. We just got to trust that God's will is going to work out for us that way. That's one way to do it, and I think in a very shallow way when we don't think about it all that deeply, or with some caveat, if we think about it very deeply that way, that can really work for us. I think most people don't think about it that deeply who hold on to that view. And I think it gives them it's kind of like a comfort pillow, where they can just sort of cruise through life knowing, well, it must be God's will. So they just have this trust, which is awesome, that sort of like, well, God's going to work it out, which is actually true. And some people who go to great depth to think through the deep theological implications of a God who is in control of everything, when some of those pieces of everything is completely incongruent with the character and nature of God. Well, that's some deep weeds, man. Hats off to you. I think there's a different way to think about the sovereignty of God in terms of God being in control. I do think that we live in a world that, there's a lot of random stuff going on. There's a lot of weird stuff going on. We're all formed in different ways. We live our lives in different ways, and sometimes the way we live our lives comes out not so good for other people around us or ourselves, and that causes a lot of chaos, a lot of crap, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. I think some natural things happen in our world. That's just the fact of life of our world. Lightning strikes and starts a fire, and that fire ravages communities. That kind of stuff happens. Weather patterns happen, and all of a sudden you got a hurricane. The earth shakes, creates a tsunami, and tens of thousands of people are killed. I think that's living in a living, breathing world. I think that's just the reality of things. I don't think that's God's. I don't think God's directing those things. I don't think God is blowing clouds in a certain direction. I don't think God sent a fire to Malibu to wipe out all those liberal movie stars. So I don't think that's how it works. I do think that God takes all of our lives, especially the hard stuff that we don't want to look at, and I think God has an amazing capacity to work those into the tapestry of our lives to do something beautiful. And in that sense, God is able to help shift what would have been horrible stuff into very beautiful things. I think that's actually how God is working all of history. He's taken the whole big mess of it, and over time, with time, not excusing the horrific things that happened, but just think when we're on the other side of the veil, we're not going to say, oh, okay, well, I'm sure glad that terrible thing happened. But I think we are going to look at it and say, I'm sure glad God was in the mix, because it could have been so much worse or horrible. It could have just led to more horrible upon horrible upon horrible. And instead, there were redemptive things that happened. So I believe in the perennial tradition, life, death, resurrection. And we all experience death kicking and screaming. We don't want it to happen, and yet it's that very death of things that fosters the capacity for resurrection. which is a very beautiful thing. So see that in Jesus, this beautiful life, and then a horrific death. That wasn't the end of the story. There was resurrection. So something beautiful. Even I don't think the way Jesus died. Oh, this is a whopper. I don't think the way Jesus died was the way that God would have intended. That's a whole other episode. But God was able to use that death, that horrific thing, and do something beautiful with it. And that's a kind of control that I can live with. The other kind of control, I can't live with that because there are too many innocent people suffering. That does not reflect a God that I would want to follow. So if that's who God is, I don't know that we need that God. That's not the God I've understood. That's not the God that's worked in my life. And I don't think that's the one that we're supposed to see. Hope this helps.